There is a specific kind of quiet that people who have lived through extended power outages describe in almost identical terms. They do not talk about the darkness. They do not talk about the heat or the cold. What they talk about is the moment they reached for something ordinary. Something they had used without thinking hundreds of times before, and realized it was no longer there for them. Not because they lost it, because the grid went down and took it with them. That moment is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It arrives like a slow exhale, the kind that doesn't quite end. And the reason it stays with people is not because the item itself was rare or expensive. It's because it was so obvious, so assumed, so woven into the fabric of daily life that preparing for its absence never felt necessary. This video is about 9 of those things, not 9 exotic survival supplies, not 9 pieces of gear you need to order from a specialty website, 9 things that most American households already use, already depend on, and almost never think twice about, until the lights go out and don't come back on schedule. And what makes this particular list different from anything you may have seen before is not the items themselves. It is what happens to each of them across time. Because there is a version of a blackout that lasts 4 hours and changes almost nothing. And there is a version that stretches across 4 days, or 7, or, as happened in Puerto Rico following Hurricane Maria in 2017, more than 11 months for some communities. The longest blackout in American history. And in that version, the things on this list do not just become inconvenient. They become the center of every decision a family makes. So we are going to move through each of these 9 things slowly, not as a checklist, as a discovery, because the point is not just to know what they are. The point is to understand what they become when time is the variable. When the outage stretches past the first night, past the first week, into the territory that most people never seriously imagine. Because that is exactly the territory where preparation either pays off or runs out. We start with number 9. Number 9 is something almost no one thinks of as a blackout item. It is something you probably used this morning without registering it as a technology at all. And that invisibility is precisely the problem. Running water, or more specifically, the assumption that running water is independent of the electrical grid. For most people in American cities, this assumption holds. Municipal water systems are pressurized and have backup power, so a standard outage doesn't immediately drain the taps. But that assumption has a shelf life, and it is much shorter than people expect. During Hurricane Harvey in 2017, more than 30 water systems across Texas experienced outages or boil water notices simultaneously. The Federal Emergency Management Agency later documented that water infrastructure failures began cascading within the first 48 to 72 hours of sustained grid disruption. Not because pipes broke, but because the pumping stations, treatment facilities, and monitoring systems that keep municipal water safe all depend on electricity. When backup generators run out of fuel, or when the logistics of refueling them become impossible during a widespread emergency, the water keeps flowing for a while, and then it doesn't. And if you live outside a major city, on well water, the math is even simpler and more immediate. No power means no pump, means no water. Period. From the first hour, here is what makes this item number 9 specifically, rather than number 1. Most people have some intuitive awareness that water matters in a crisis. They may not have stored enough of it, but they have heard the message. What they have almost never thought through is the secondary layer. Sanitation. Not drinking water. Sanitation, water. Because when the taps slow down or stop, the things that require running water in your home begin to fail in a specific order. Toilet flushing, hand washing, wound cleaning, cooking that requires boiling. And each of those failures carries a different consequence timeline. The CDC recommends 1 gallon of water per person per day for drinking and basic sanitation. Most emergency managers suggest a 2-week supply for serious preparedness. Most American households have close to 0 gallons stored, not because people are careless, because the tap has never failed them. And the tap, in a long outage, is not a guarantee. The thing to understand about number 9 is this. Water is not an emergency item you add to your preparedness plan. It is the foundation that every other item on this list depends on. Store it before anything else. Store more than you think you need. And know, specifically, where you would get more if your stored supply ran out. That brings us to number 8. And number 8 is where the list begins to get uncomfortable, because this one lives in your medicine cabinet right now. Prescription medications. Not the idea of medication in general. The specific, practical reality of what happens to a household's prescription supply during a multi-day or multi-week power outage. And what happens to the pharmacies and healthcare systems those households depend on for refills. During the 2003 Northeast blackout, which affected 55 million people across 8 U.S. states and parts of Canada, and lasted between 1 and 4 days depending on location, hospitals across the affected region reported a significant spike in medication-related emergency visits within the first 36 hours. Not because the blackout directly harmed people's medications, because people ran out, because their home refrigerators lost power and their insulin went bad, because their pharmacies couldn't process electronic prescriptions, because their doctors' offices were closed and their telehealth systems were offline. Insulin is the clearest example, but it is far from the only one. Certain cardiac medications, some psychiatric medications, specific formulations of thyroid treatment, all of them have storage requirements, refill timelines, or dosing dependencies that become logistical challenges the moment the grid becomes unreliable. And the challenge does not announce itself in advance. It compounds quietly, day by day, until what began as a minor inconvenience becomes a medical emergency. Most people, when they think about medical preparedness, think about bandages and pain relievers. Those matter, but the deeper layer, the layer that determines real vulnerability, is the intersection of prescription dependency and grid dependency. If anyone in your household takes a medication daily, the question is not just whether you have enough for today. The question is whether you have enough for 10 days, for 2 weeks, and whether the version of that medication you store requires refrigeration. Because if it does, and if your power goes out for more than 4 hours, you need a plan that does not involve your kitchen refrigerator. Talk to your prescribing physician before a crisis, not during one. Ask about emergency supplies. Ask about storage. Ask about what the protocol is if you cannot reach a pharmacy. These are not dramatic questions. They are the questions that people who lived through extended outages wish they had asked before the event, not after it. Number 7 feels completely different from number 7, and that contrast is intentional. Number 7 is light. Specifically, the layered, redundant, long-duration capacity to create light in a home that has no electricity. And before you think you already have this handled because you own a flashlight, stay with me, because what makes light a number 7 item is not its absence in the first hour. It is its psychology across multiple nights. The first night of a blackout, people adapt. Candles come out. Fun flashlights switch on. There's an almost nostalgic feeling to it, a campfire quality that makes the evening feel manageable, even mildly fun for families with children. The second night is more subdued. By the third night, something shifts. The inconvenience of navigating a dark house becomes wearing in a way that is hard to articulate, but impossible to ignore. The disruption to sleep, to routine, to the sense that the environment is under control. It begins to accumulate. Researchers studying disaster psychology have documented what they call normalcy disruption fatigue, the compounding psychological weight of living without basic environmental controls. Light is one of the earliest and most persistent triggers of this effect. Not because darkness itself is dangerous, but because the human nervous system interprets sustained darkness as a signal of threat, even when the intellectual mind knows otherwise. Children feel this first and most acutely. But adults feel it too. The practical answer is layered redundancy. Flashlights with a confirmed fresh battery supply, multiple candles, not decorative candles but actual emergency candles rated for extended burn time, some of which can last 40 hours each. Battery-operated LED lanterns, which provide ambient room light rather than directional beam light, and which are categorically better for multi-night family use than handheld flashlights. Solar-charged lanterns, which eliminate the battery supply concern entirely if the outage extends beyond your battery reserves, and a consistent mental accounting of how much light capacity your household actually has, as opposed to how much you assume you have. Here is the mistake most households make with light. They own the devices, but they have not maintained them. A flashlight with corroded batteries from 3 years ago is not a light source. It is a false sense of security. Check your light supply the way you check your smoke detectors. Because in a long outage, light is not decoration. It is the difference between a functional household and one that is quietly deteriorating. Number 6 is the one most people push back on when they hear it, until they think about it for more than 30 seconds. Cash, physical currency, bills, actual paper money held in your home at a denomination level that is genuinely useful. Meaning not exclusively 20s, but a range of smaller bills that allow you to make purchases without needing change. Here is why this belongs on this list, and why it belongs specifically on a list about extended blackouts rather than just general preparedness. Every payment system that American households currently use as a primary transaction method, credit cards, debit cards, mobile payments, peer-to-peer transfer apps, checks processed electronically, requires the electrical grid to function, not just the merchant's terminal. The entire network infrastructure behind it. When that infrastructure goes down regionally, commerce does not pause politely. It stops. During the Northeast blackout of 2003, news coverage captured something that stuck with people who watched it. Gasoline stations that were open and had fuel, physically unable to sell it. Their pumps were electric. Their point-of-sale systems were down. Drivers who had cash, actual paper bills, were the only ones who could negotiate direct transactions with station owners who chose to sell manually. Everyone else was stranded. This pattern has repeated in essentially every major regional blackout since Harvey, Sandy, Maria, the 2021 Texas winter storm that left 4.5 million households without power for days during record cold. In each event, cash became a premium commodity within 48 hours of grid failure. Not because ATMs ran out of money, but because ATMs require power and network connectivity to operate, and both were gone. The recommendation from multiple financial preparedness guides, including those published by FEMA, is a minimum of several $100s in mixed bills stored at home in a secure but accessible location. Not in your primary wallet, not in your car, at home, in a place you can reach in the dark if necessary, and updated periodically, because emergency cash that you have quietly spent and not replaced is the same as no emergency cash at all. Number 5 is where the list begins to move into territory that feels more personal. Because number 5 is not about an object or a resource, it is about information. Specifically, it is about offline information, the knowledge and documentation that your household needs to function, make decisions, and protect itself, stored in a form that does not require internet access, cloud connectivity, or a charged phone to retrieve. Think for a moment about where the critical information in your life currently lives. Your family's medical records, your insurance policy numbers, the contact information for your doctor, your pharmacist, your children's school, your out-of-state family members, the location of your home's water shutoff valve, the manual for your home's electrical panel, evacuation routes from your neighborhood, the phone numbers, actual phone numbers, not just contact names in an app, of the 10 people most important to your family's safety. For the vast majority of American households, the honest answer is almost all of that information exists exclusively in digital form, in apps, in cloud storage, in browser history, in email threads, and in a sustained blackout, when phones are rationed to essential calls to preserve battery life, and when cellular networks, which also depend on backup power with limited duration, begin degrading under load. That information becomes inaccessible at precisely the moment you need it most. The 2017 Puerto Rico blackout generated a body of research that is quietly one of the most important emergency management datasets in American history. Among its findings, families who had documented critical information offline, in physical notebooks, printed contact sheets, or laminated reference cards, made significantly better decisions during the extended outage and reported lower levels of crisis-induced anxiety than families who had not. The information itself did not change. The access to it did, and access during a grid failure is everything. Build a physical information packet for your household. It does not need to be elaborate. A waterproof folder, a few printed pages, a current set of contact numbers written by hand. Update it once a year. Know exactly where it is. This is not a dramatic act of survivalism. It is the same logic as keeping a spare key. You hope you never need it, and you are deeply relieved to have it when you do. Number 4 is the one that almost always surprises people, because it is something that everyone in the household uses every single day, and it is something that runs out faster in an emergency than in normal life, not slower. Hygiene supplies, specifically soap, hand sanitizer, toilet paper, feminine hygiene products, diapers for households with infants, and the basic over-the-counter medications that manage the minor health issues that extended stress, disrupted sleep, reduced access to clean water, and changed eating patterns reliably produce. During a blackout, the body does not get a corresponding vacation from its biological needs. What changes is the ease of meeting those needs. Washing hands when water is limited requires soap to work more efficiently. Managing sanitation when toilets may not flush reliably requires specific hygiene awareness and supplies. And the stress response itself, elevated cortisol, disrupted sleep, increased anxiety, directly suppresses the immune system, which is why respiratory infections, gastrointestinal issues, and skin conditions spike measurably in disaster-affected populations within the first 2 weeks of an extended event. The Centers for Disease Control published data after Hurricane Katrina, documenting that a significant proportion of post-disaster illness reports involved conditions that were not caused by the disaster directly, but by the hygiene and health management failures that followed it. This pattern is consistent across nearly every major American emergency event of the past 30 years. The preparedness answer is straightforward in principle and neglected in practice. Maintain a deliberately oversized supply of hygiene and basic medical consumables. Not what you need for 1 week, what you need for 4. Because in a genuine extended emergency, resupply is not a reliable option, and the items that keep your family physically and psychologically stable are not the dramatic survival items. They are the ordinary ones you never thought to stockpile. Number 3, and here, the tone changes. Because number 3 is about what happens inside a household when an extended outage pushes past the novelty phase, past the management phase, and into the endurance phase. And what happens there is both predictable and almost entirely unprepared for. Communication and morale infrastructure. The capacity, specifically planned and provisioned, to receive accurate emergency information from outside the household and to maintain psychological cohesion within it. Start with information. In a sustained regional blackout, the standard digital information ecosystem fails. Social media requires internet. News websites require internet. Emergency alerts sent to phones require cellular infrastructure that, after 48 to 72 hours of backup generator fuel depletion, begins to go silent in areas not prioritized for emergency restoration. What remains, reliably, without grid dependency, is AM/FM radio and no AA weather radio, specifically battery-operated or hand-crank radio receivers, which cost between $15 and $40 at any major retailer and which, in a declared regional emergency, become the primary official information channel for evacuation orders, shelter locations, resource distribution sites, and restoration timelines. FEMA explicitly lists a battery-powered or hand-crank radio as a core emergency kit item in every version of its published guidance, and yet surveys of American household emergency preparedness consistently find that fewer than 1 in 4 households owns one. The gap between what is recommended and what is actually in place is one of the most consistent findings in emergency management research. Now, the morale layer. This is the one that preparedness conversations almost never reach. And it is the one that the research from extended disasters suggests may be among the most consequential. During Puerto Rico's 11-month blackout, mental health professionals documented a significant surge in anxiety disorders, depression, and trauma responses, not only among people who had experienced direct physical harm, but among people who were physically safe and adequately supplied, but psychologically depleted by the relentlessness of the situation, the absence of routine, the inability to work normally, the disruption to children's schooling and social lives, the sustained low-grade uncertainty about when normal would return. What protected families most was not material abundance. It was social structure within the home. Families that had deliberately preserved some elements of normalcy, scheduled meals, evening activities, assigned responsibilities for each family member, maintained bedtimes for children, reported significantly better psychological outcomes than those who had allowed structure to dissolve entirely. Preparation for an extended outage in this light is not only logistical, it is psychological. It means having the games, the books, the activities, the conversation rituals that allow a family to remain a functioning unit under sustained pressure. Number two is the one that no amount of post-disaster reading can fully substitute for having thought through in advance. Heat and cold management. The capacity of a household to maintain a survivable temperature range without electrical heating, cooling, or ventilation, and the specific supplies and knowledge required to do that safely. This is not a minor logistical detail. It is the variable that most frequently turns an uncomfortable blackout into a life-threatening one. And the data on this is unambiguous. The 1995 Chicago heat wave killed 739 people in 5 days. The majority of the victims were elderly individuals living alone in apartments without air conditioning, who did not open windows or seek cooling centers because they feared crime, because they did not know resources were available, or because their social isolation meant no one came to check on them until it was too late. That event is now studied as a textbook case in what happens when a population has no heat management plan and no social connection infrastructure to activate during a thermal emergency. The 2021 Texas winter storm, Uri, produced the opposite version of the same failure. Temperatures dropped to levels not seen in that state in decades. Homes built without insulation appropriate for sustained freezing, heated by electrical systems that had gone offline, became dangerously cold within 12 to 24 hours. At least 246 people died in weather-related incidents during that event, with many deaths involving hypothermia in homes, in cars, or during attempts to find warmth at unsafe improvised sources. Carbon monoxide poisoning from improperly used generators, gas stoves used for heating, or charcoal grills brought indoors claimed additional lives. Exactly the kind of improvised heating that the Consumer Product Safety Commission warns against repeatedly, and that exhausted, cold, unprepared people turn to anyway. Thermal preparedness means knowing 2 things in advance. What is your plan if your home becomes too hot? And what is your plan if it becomes too cold? For heat, window coverings to block solar gain, battery-operated fans, identification of accessible public cooling centers, and knowledge of the early symptoms of heat exhaustion and heat stroke in yourself and in your family members. For cold, a plan to shelter in the smallest, most insulated interior room using body heat and high-quality sleeping bags or emergency blankets. Layered clothing accessible without searching through cold storage, and an explicit rule against any improvised combustion heat source inside the home. The carbon monoxide deaths from these events are not anomalies. They are predictable consequences of a household that had no plan and turned to the nearest dangerous alternative. Know your thermal thresholds. Know your plan. Know them now, while the temperature in your home is comfortable and the decision is not urgent. And then there is number one. Number one is the thing that takes the longest to describe and the least time to understand once you have heard it. It is not a physical item. It is not a supply. It cannot be purchased in a store, and it cannot be improvised in the middle of a crisis. But it is the single factor that most consistently determines whether a household navigates an extended blackout as a manageable challenge or as a cascading emergency. It is a household decision framework. Specifically, the pre-established, discussed, agreed-upon set of decisions that your household will make. And who has the authority to make them? When the grid goes down and does not come back on a predictable schedule. When does your family evacuate versus shelter in place? Who makes that call? And what information do they need before they make it? What is the threshold, temperature, water supply level, medical condition, communication loss that triggers each major response? Where do family members go if they cannot reach each other? Who is the out-of-state contact that everyone calls to check in with? Because out-of-state calls are often more reliable than local ones during a regional emergency. What is the plan for family members who are not home when an outage begins? At school, at work, at a relative's house? These decisions do not need to be complicated. They need to be made in advance and understood by every person in the household old enough to act on them. Because, in the actual moments of a serious emergency, cognitive load spikes, stress hormones compromise decision-making, and the temptation to defer or to wait for more information creates delays that compound into consequences. Emergency management researchers use a concept called pre-commitment to describe decisions that are made before the stress of an event, when the mind is calm and the options are all available. Pre-committed decisions outperform real-time decisions in emergency contexts by a significant margin. Not because the pre-committed decision is always optimal, but because having any clear decision is better than the paralysis that comes from trying to reason through complex logistics while frightened, cold, in the dark, and responsible for people who are looking at you for answers. The families who fared best in Puerto Rico. The families who got out before Harvey's flooding closed the roads. The families in Texas who survived Uri without carbon monoxide exposure. They were not universally the best supplied families. Many of them were not particularly wealthy or resource-rich. They were the families who had talked through what they would do before the moment arrived. They had a plan. The plan was imperfect, but it was a plan, and they used it, and that made the difference. Number one is not a supply. It is a conversation. Have it before you need it. Here is what is worth sitting with after everything on this list. 8 of these 9 things involve physical items or practical skills. Things you can buy, store, maintain, or learn. And those things matter. They matter enormously. And the gap between American households that have them and those that do not is wider than most emergency management professionals are comfortable saying publicly. But number one is different. Number one costs nothing. It requires no special equipment, no storage space, no trip to a hardware store. It requires only time and intention and the willingness to have an honest conversation with the people you are responsible for protecting. A conversation that most families keep finding reasons to postpone. Next weekend. After the holidays. When things slow down. The shelves tell the truth eventually. So does a thermometer in a house that has no heat and no plan. The question is whether you read that truth before the moment it matters or during it. There is a phrase that emergency professionals use among themselves, quietly, with a kind of tired specificity that only comes from responding to the same events over and over again. The people who prepared look different from the people who didn't, not because they have more things, but because they have fewer decisions left to make. Fewer decisions left to make. That is what preparedness actually is. Not a bunker, not an arsenal, not a dramatic statement about the fragility of civilization. It is the simple, practical act of making decisions in advance about water, about medications, about light, about cash, about information, about hygiene, about communication, about heat. So that when the grid fails and the house goes quiet and the people you love are looking at you, you already know what you are going to do next. The lights go out. They always do eventually, somewhere, for someone. The question is only what you have decided before that moment arrives. And speaking of what disappears when the grid goes down, there is an entire category of pantry items that most people think they understand, but actually mismanage almost every time. Foods that have a false sense of security. Foods that last longer than people think. Foods that fail earlier than anyone expects. That is where we go next.